Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us again for our Summer 2023 FCI Live series. We're on our third day. We have a whole bunch more content coming next week, and we'll be sending out the registration for that in case you missed any of those sessions and want to add them even denser next week, even more content. But I'm excited for today because you guys asked for a lot more governance-y, detail-y stuff, and that is one of my faves and is also just so important for startup food co-ops. Love to see you guys paying attention to this. So this was a topic that I've had requests for repeatedly, and Joel Kopischke from Seven Roots has graciously offered to cover it for us. We're going to talk about the seemingly confusing ins and outs of what the heck this policy governance thing is that everyone keeps talking about, this form of governance that food co-ops use that sounds really difficult and like something we'll deal with someday when we have some free time. So we're going to be covering some of that before we get started. Just a tiny bit of housekeeping. Please do mute and stay on mute unless the speaker requests that you come off mute, because we're recording. And of course, the number one question I get, yes, these are all being recorded, and I will be emailing out all the videos from the entire series to absolutely anyone who registered for any session in the series the afternoon of Monday, July 3rd. So you will absolutely get those recordings. They'll be on our YouTube channel. I will point you to them with the email reminding you you wanted those, and you can share them out with other board members and everyone else who didn't get a chance to be here, re-review what you learned. We're so excited to have you guys, so excited to have those videos. Please do share them out. Real quick, this series would not be possible without our champion sponsor for this FCI Live Summer Series, the National Co-op Grocers. Thank you to them for making it possible. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn you over to the person you want to be talking to. We're ready to dive into policy governance power with Joel Kopischke. And just a little background, Joel will tell you how long, but he has extremely extensive experience and background, both in policy governance and working with established food co-op boards, but also specifically onboarding startup food co-op boards to policy governance so they can, as they work through their development stages and then transition into GM. So can't think of anyone better to be here and do this with us. And I'm going to turn over the screen to Joel. Thanks for being here.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, JQ. You know, when JQ asks, do you want to do something? I always say yes. And then I ask, what do you want me to do? So, I'm really excited to be here. Yeah, so we're going to talk about policy governance today. You can't really cover policy governance in less than an hour. There's just too much fun to squeeze in, but we're going to do our best. So I am here from Seven Roots. We do design and operation support for food co-ops. We work with Seven Roots because we believe in healthy food access, community ownership, and the co-op model. We're a proud worker co-op. I'm Joel Kopischke. I use he, they for my pronouns. Once upon a time, I accidentally got elected to the board of directors at Outpost Natural Foods. I had no idea what I was doing, but I eventually, through some wonderful mentoring and teaching, I learned about governance, and I learned about policy governance, and I really enjoy both of them. So I am a proud governance nerd and a policy governance nerd. I've worked with a bunch of startups, Friendly City, East Aurora, and dozens of co-ops around the country, lots and lots of food co-ops and some other ones, worker co-ops, distribution co-ops, ag co-ops. And I've kind of brought all of that experience into the work I do now. JQ and I have presented together on governance at Up and Coming. So we've had a lot of fun with this. My colleague Heather Lazikis is here, is going to help. I've told Heather to jump in and translate to English if I get too governance wonky. So that'll be one of Heather.
I'm not a governance nerd, but I'm glad to play one here on this session.
So I'm not sure how much time we're going to have for Q&A, but if you've got questions, put them into the chat, and if I think I can tackle it in a moment, I will. If I need to circle back later, I'll do that. And if you want to follow up with me at some point, put your email in the chat, and you can start doing that now if you want, or you can sit back and decide later. But that'll be the best way to get connected. So let's dig in. Without further ado, outcomes. We're going to learn about policy governance. We're going to cover foundational principles. We're going to look at how it looks in practice, how and when to implement. That seems really simple. And there's going to be a lot that we're going to dig into to flesh each of those little bullet points out. So some of this next stuff I'm going to cover is stuff that I've covered before. So I'm hearing some noise here. If we could, if everyone could mute, that'd be appreciated. Thank you. So I'm gonna fly through these pretty quickly. I've gone into them in depth. I think at the last the last FCI Live that I did. But what is governance? Governance means we're steering our organization towards success, and we're answering key questions, making decisions, defining roles and responsibilities, and we're establishing processes for setting expectations and ensuring accountability. So in cooperative governance, that specifically looks like articulating direction and purpose and facilitating movement in that direction, working together effectively for shared purpose, empowering people and then holding them accountable, and creating and sustaining a culture of participation and keeping the democracy healthy in our cooperative organization. So governance looks like making decisions on behalf of others and setting expectations, promoting and representing the co-op, hiring staff until a GM is hired. So that's some of the things that governance is going to do. And then some of the elements of governance, we have trusteeship. So the board acts as a trustee for the organization, as stewards of the organization. The board is focused on vision and future focus. There's a lot of delegation that occurs. Working boards, there's less delegation that's occurring. But when you're a governance board and when you're doing governance, that's about delegation and oversight. And the very important aspect of delegation is we don't just tell someone what to do or that it's their responsibility. We also have to check, so that accountability loop. And we have that role clarity, unity of voice when we're as a governance group. And part of our job is perpetuation, to be sure that the co-op exists, or the good governance exists beyond me being there. So as we each think of it, it's just like, have we built systems that will stand up? Have we built a culture that will endure and will attract the next round of leaders? So we sped through that. Now we're on to what is policy governance. Well, I'm gonna do a curveball here, and I'm gonna start with, what is it not? It's not a magic wand, a silver bullet. It's not the solution to all of your problems. It's not going to fix everything. It's not restrictive. It doesn't. Policy governance does not dictate what can and cannot happen. It's really good at giving guidelines for maybe what should or should not happen, but it does not override any greater authority, such as state law or your bylaws or anything like that. It's not hands off. It helps guide boards to not meddle, to not muck up clear roles and responsibilities, but it's not hands off. It can be absolutely as hands-on as you want it to be. And there are trade-offs for being hands-on. And it is not perfect. That's for sure. But it's very good. And I haven't found a system that works better. So now let's talk about.
I just had to highlight that. I don't love this system, but I've never met one that's better. I'll shut up now.
It's what was it? Didn't Churchill say about democracy? It's the least worst option.
Yes.
So yeah. So what is it? So this is a bit of a grab bag on this slide. Sometimes it's called Carver governance. John Carver developed this model. I had the pleasure of working with, studying policy governance with John and Miriam Carver. John Carver is actually a really funny guy in person. Everything he writes about policy governance is super dry. And I asked him, I'm like, why is it so dry? Why don't you, and he's like, well, I want it to stay absolutely focused on the principles and the policies. And I don't want any of the fluff to get in the way. And I'm like, okay, I get that. And I'm not sure it's serving the purpose in the long run, as well as making some of his writing a little more fun could have been. But anyway, policy governance is like an operating system or a tool. It's not the goal, but it's something that'll help you get to the goal, help you reach your goals. So we can think of it in that way, the same way that an operating system on a computer helps us do things, but it doesn't exist for itself. There's no purpose for it to exist except to serve what you're trying to get done. It's a collection of principles and practices. Carver took these principles that he was seeing in the nonprofit world, in the corporate world. He didn't even really have his eye on the co-op world. So it's ironic that it's found such a strong foothold here. But he was working with nonprofits and he was working in the corporate world, and he found some practices that actually, it's like, oh, these actually apply across both of these very disparate types of organizations. And these aren't necessarily concepts that he came up with, but he brought them together into a model, into this tool. Policy governance is best practice. In the food co-op world, it's considered best practice. I don't have numbers, maybe JQ does, in terms of percent of co-ops that are using it. I've heard 80%. I have no idea if that's accurate or not.
I think it's higher because every time I have a co-op that's not using it, I'm like, well, here's an example of a food co-op that's not using it. Then they switch to it. So I'm running out of examples. So I think it's higher.
We just need to list all the co-ops and then they'll switch to it. Okay.
I don't know, but every time I try and use an example, they're like, oh no, we switched. So I'm out of examples of open food co-ops that don't use policy governance to some degree.
All righty. Okay. And it's, as the name may imply, it's policy based. So now the question is, what does that mean? So let's see. There we go. What is a policy? So a policy is something that is agreed upon. It's an agreed upon, written down expectation or standard. That's all a policy is. And what policies are is they're proactive. So instead of having to make reactive decisions, we can put our guidelines in place. We can set standards. And so that's a tool of efficiency, and it's a tool of good leadership, where we're setting people up to succeed. We're setting the expectations down in writing in advance, instead of waiting to see what we get back and then deciding if that's good enough. So there we go. So policy governance simplified. We set expectations. It can be for achievement or for compliance. We assign authority, and then we verify performance. And we write all of this down. So that is policy governance at its core, is what we're doing. Is we're writing down these expectations, we're assigning it to someone, and then we're following up. Did that person or did that committee or did that group accomplish what they were supposed to accomplish? And did they stay in compliance? One and or both of those. So what kinds of policies are we talking about? In policy governance, they're grouped into, there's different ways of looking at it, either 3 or 4 different categories. So the ends, that's one of the categories. And this describes not what the organization does, but the impact it has. So it's focused on outcomes. It's focused on what's the difference we're here to make. What's the big why in our why we have this co-op. Why did we choose to, why are we, for all startups, why are you doing this? It's pretty clear to you already. And when you write that down, that's when it becomes your ends. So limitations, another type of policy. And this is what we won't do while we're in pursuit of the ends. So these are the boundaries we're going to put in place. I sometimes think of it as like a soccer field. This is the boundary we're going to draw around the soccer field. Everything else is out of bounds, but we can do lots of creative things inside the boundaries. And then there are some process policies, or sometimes referred to as means, how we're going to do things. How the board will do its job is the primary set of process policies. And that includes how we're going to be a good boss, because being a good boss can be really difficult. So we set that aside as a separate set of policies. So what are some samples here? Before we get to the samples, I have a diagram. Forgot about the diagram. So here's the policies that we were just talking about. So we've got our ends policies, which define what we're trying to achieve in the world. We've got our limitations policies over to the right. These are for the GM to guide successful performance. And the board will use these. We'll use the accountability loop that we were talking about, that third step in the policy governance simplified, which is to verify performance. And the board is going to do this monthly. So we're going to be continually doing performance evaluation. And then the process policies over on the left, these are for the board. Tell the board how to do our job. We're going to set expectations for ourselves, defines duties, and it defines the GM relationship. And speaking of the GM relationship, that's right in the middle here, board GM relationship. These are for the board and the GM. And it really focuses on how to be a good boss. What is that communication going to look like? How are we going to interact? Because it can be difficult to be a good boss. And if you have 7 or 9 people who are trying to act as a good boss, it gets way more complicated. So we really want to be sure we've got some good guidelines, some good expectations set so we can do that job in a good way. And it defines how the board and the GM are going to interact. All right, now we've got some samples. So what might these look like in practice? An ends policy might say something like, because the co-op exists, our community has access to healthy food. So it doesn't say we're going to sell groceries, which would be what we do. What it says is, what's the impact we're going to have? What's the outcome we want? And it specifically says for who? Our community. And you can describe that any way you want. And access to healthy food. And there might be some other things that you want to say as well, but this is one sample. Great, a sample of a limitation policy. The GM must not allow cash on hand to be insufficient. That seems pretty straightforward. That's a good one. We want to have enough money to pay our bills and to pay our staff. Great. So that's a sample of a limitation policy. And you will see that it is worded in kind of the thou shalt not sort of language. And because it's done that way, so it sets a boundary. Because we want to empower the GM, and it's actually more empowering. I found the negative language really frustrating when I first started, but I realize it's more empowering. Because if I say, this is what you're supposed to do, then that limits what they can do. If I say, this is what you should not do, then everything else is a possibility. So that's why we use, sorry, yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I was going to say it's more empowering. And the other thing about it is that then the GM is making those choices and there's more accountability there. If you're prescriptive in providing direction, then ultimately the person providing the direction, or the group, the board maybe, providing that direction, takes responsibility for the results. However, we want the GM to have accountability for the decisions they make in operating the store. And therefore, we give them the boundaries, and it's up to them on how they're going to get there, so that then they can be held accountable for those results.
And if we're all going to jump in also, because the GM needs the freedom to use the expertise they have to do what they need to do, and having to take the board along in every decision and make it make sense to the board is a horrible use of their time and resources and will not be best for anyone. So we just want them to know what they can't do and hold them accountable to that, and give them room to use their talent.
Yeah, because there are things that totally make sense to me, as far as a way of approaching something, and for Heather, she will take a different approach and use her skills in a different way, and we'll get to the same outcome. But if I were to say, Heather, you need to do this in this way, or if Heather were to tell me, you need to do this in this way, that makes the most sense to me, it's not necessarily going to be the most efficient. It's not going to make the use of my skills and my abilities and my process. So if we identify outcome and limitations, that really empowers the GM. So for the board, we're not going to word it in quite the same way. And for the board, we're going to set expectations for ourselves. So one way to do that is we could say, well, the board will make decisions by majority vote after adequate research and or discussion. So just set a policy for how we're going to make decisions. You know, that policy could say the board will make decisions using trial by combat. That is also a way that decisions could be made. Don't recommend it. But these are sample policies that we can have. And then for the board GM relationship, we could say something like only approved policies and board decisions are binding on the GM. So if Joel is your board chair and Joel tells the GM to do something, it may not be binding unless it's an approved policy or board decision. Okay, so those are some samples. So there are 10 foundational principles of policy governance. 3 of them are these policy buckets we've just talked about. The ends policies, worded in the form of outcomes, results, impact for some group of individuals at some cost or priority. And that at some cost or priority can sometimes be optional. It's the least important in my estimation of your ends policy, but you can apply some priority or some level of cost to apply to those outcomes. So you could say we're here for healthy access. We're here to provide, good paying jobs. And then you could say, the most important is healthy access. So board means is another foundational principle. We talked about those, how the board will do its job, including how to be a good boss, executive limitations, boundaries on our GM behavior. So those are 3 of the foundational principles. So as we craft those policies, the idea is we start very broad. So we start, sometimes they talk about it like nesting bowls, if you've got those kind of nesting bowls, but you start at the broadest and say, all right, the general manager must not do anything, that is immoral, unethical, illegal, or goes against generally accepted business practices. That's a great, very broad limitation to set. And then we can ask ourselves, okay, is this specific enough? And I'm gonna do a little foreshadowing and look at number 5 here. Can we accept any reasonable interpretation of this policy? And then we say, we might need to add more here. So then we might add, we need to have adequate, we can't allow us to have inadequate solvency, liquidity, sales growth, profitability. And then we ask ourselves, as we write and assess the policies, can we accept any reasonable interpretation? So some of our policies will be very broad, some will be a little bit more narrow. So we don't add every good idea, we only add more policies when we can't accept any reasonable interpretation. So then we've got our reasonable interpretation of policies, and then we also apply that when we monitor them. Because your general manager is going to take the policies and they're going to interpret them. And we have to ask ourselves, not, is this the interpretation I would apply, or is this my favorite interpretation of this policy, but is this a reasonable interpretation? And again, these three are tied together pretty closely here. With that monitoring is that closing of the loop of the accountability. So we empower, we delegate, and then we want to verify that those expectations have been met, what the performance has been. And we call that process monitoring. And we could probably spend a half hour just on monitoring and how to do that well, and what that can look like. So we're more than halfway there on our foundational principles here. So these are the last four. Ownership. Just the concept that the board is acting on behalf of the owners. So that's a pretty simple one. And then related to that is board position. And that's basically just laying out, as we think of organizational hierarchy, as we think of organizational accountability, the board is accountable to the owners. Another principle is delegation. There's clarity and coherence of roles and authority. And I think this is where policy governance really, really shines, in my estimation, is how it sets up groups to really delegate well, be successful in that, including that accountability monitoring piece. And then this is maybe my favorite one, board holism. The board speaks in one voice. And this can be confusing because we're all individuals. And actually, like as we discuss things, we want to speak in individual voices and we want to discuss in individual voices. But when the board makes a decision, we speak in one voice. And that is not just a good idea, but it's actually what the law says, because only the board as a decision-making body has authority. Individuals on the board have very little authority. So if the board as an entity is the one that has authority, then it needs to speak clearly in one voice. So, and what does that look like? Well, it might look like you've got 7 people on your board, and 4 people like what the general manager, or 3 people like what the general manager is doing, 3 people don't, and 1 isn't sure. So if you give that feedback to the GM, what's the GM supposed to do with that? How do they act? So the board has to decide. So the board has to come to a clear decision so we can communicate clearly as if it's a single person. So that's a really, really powerful concept. It can be tricky in practice. And this is one where people say, well, it's restrictive because it doesn't let me speak. But actually, what's restrictive is policy governance is good at reminding folks that legally, as individuals, you have very little authority, and the authority rests with the decision-making body.
Joel, the way I think about this as well, and check me if I'm not right here, but if the board is making a decision or speaking externally, any individual board member, you are representing the group. So that's another way I think about it is, if I'm going out in the world and someone's saying, oh, hey, you're on the board, what do you think about this? Or what is the board doing about this? It's important to sort of represent the board as a whole and not your own personal opinion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It goes back to not just board holism, but ownership. Think about, okay, if I send a mixed message here, am I acting in the best interest of the co-op? Or am I actually undermining the co-op at this point? Yeah. So I can have my own opinion, and the duty on me is to support the work of the board and the decisions of the board.
This also brings up an interesting thing in board holism that I think is really important to startups that I want to jump in with real quick and ask if you've seen also, Joel, which is in startup food co-ops, and I've seen established too, but I see a lot of delegation of authority to maybe a board chair, a treasurer, a VP, 2 or 3 people, and that's great. Sometimes there's just people who have more capacity to do the work, but kind of the sense that they're responsible, they know what's going on. And actually, in reality, I love how policy governance reminds everyone that board holism means we are all equally responsible. If the board chooses to delegate some responsibility to the board chair, the board's responsibility has been handed to that chair, but the board as a whole is still responsible for what that chair is doing. And I think that's something I really love about policy governance. I see a lot of boards forget that and put way too much authority in some of those. Well, they've got it.
Yep, absolutely. Delegation is not abdication. So the board has all this authority placed in the board's hands by state law, by the bylaws, and you can delegate it, but that doesn't mean you're no longer responsible for it.
And you all have an equal amount of it as board members, because it's all on you, all of you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so here are the 10 foundational principles of policy governance. So we're going to move forward here. We're going to come back and visit these in a minute, though. Okay, so what does policy governance look like in action? We've been talking about it a little bit, but it means being proactive. So we set our policies in advance. So one of the ways that I was sold on policy governance is I was asked if we had done a budget approval for the previous year. And I said, oh, yeah. And they asked what that looked like. And I said, well, okay, they came with spreadsheets and there were charts and graphs and everything. And then the board decided. And I was asked, well, what was the criteria that the board used? And I said, oh, I don't know. We just decided. And it's like, well, did you kind of set your GM up to succeed or fail by not telling them in advance what constituted an acceptable budget? And I'm like, oh man, I never thought of it like that. Right, give the parameters for this is what success looks like in advance. So it's not this, well, go off and create a budget, and then we'll sit back and we'll decide through some secret method whether this meets our needs or not. And it's like, oh yeah, proactively saying this is what success looks like. Here's the target, and then determining, did you hit the target with that or not? And I was like, wow, that sounds like a great process compared to the other kind where we just say, you need to bring this to us and we get to approve it or not. So we set these, we're proactive, and we have our policies in place, and then we use them. So we not just, so we have policies that we're monitoring as things go on, but also questions, concerns are going to come up. And when we've got policies, the first thing we can say is, instead of reacting to that question or concern, we can stop and go, wait a minute, what do our policies say? Wherein we started very broad, so it probably lives somewhere in here. Where does this concern live in our policies? What have we said about this already? What constraints have we said? And what I found is when we take that approach, most of the time we already like, oh, we already thought about this. Maybe we didn't think specifically about this, but we already have guidelines in place, either for us as a board or limitations on the GM. And so then we're already starting with that context. And again, we don't have to be as reactive in the moment because we already have guidelines in place. And then we're using these and we're monitoring on an ongoing basis, compliance and accomplishment. So the board can check in with themselves on their expectations every month. How are we doing? Are we meeting our expectations? Once a board has a GM and you're up and running, every month you're doing monitoring of different policies. Some policies you might monitor more regularly than others, and that's fine too. But you have a regular schedule in place so we can check on compliance. And like Heather said earlier, then we're doing an ongoing performance evaluation. A performance evaluation isn't this once a year, we go, oh, all right, how are they doing? We're doing it every month. And to me, it makes it much more interactive, much more alive, much more relevant. And then we're constantly reflecting on our policies. It's like, okay, this is what we said, maybe in response to a question or concern, maybe in response to monitoring, but we're reflecting on policies. We go, oh, wait, you know what? This is what we said before. I don't know if that's what we want now. Maybe we need to be more specific. Maybe we need to be less specific. So that's one way that it looks. And so as we think about accountability in the organization, we've got the owners who, through your articles of incorporation and bylaws and state law, have authority vested in them. Through the bylaws, they delegate almost all their authority to the board. And then the board, through its policies, delegates authority to the GM. And then once you've got a store up and running, once you've got staff, the GM is delegating things to operations. And all of that is in pursuit of this impact ends outcome that we've been talking about. Are we meeting the owner's needs? And the owners and the board, the fact that the board is owners, we stay connected with this group so we can act on their behalf. And then we got our accountability loop here. The GM is reporting back to the board through monitoring reports. The board is reporting back to the owners through annual report, annual meeting, and there might be additional conversation. Maybe there's a monthly newsletter that talks about what's going on in the governance world. All righty. Now we could take that same kind of diagram and overlay the principles on it. So we still have ownership at the top, ends at the bottom. We've got this board position. The board reports to the owners. Here's our board. Board holism, we're acting as a decision-making body. We've got our board means, our board policies for process and GM relationship. Then we delegate. We've got our point of delegation, where we delegate things to the GM. And we have limitations policies. And these policies were written in sizes. Some of the boundaries are wide. Some we've made a little bit more narrow because we've looked at reasonable interpretation. And then we've got that monitoring loop going back. So hopefully this diagram is a good little reference tool. As a standalone, it probably doesn't make any sense, but hopefully it's a good reference tool now that we've kind of talked through those principles and to put them into some sort of context about what it looks like in practice. Okay. Implementing policy governance. When do you want to do it? Now. I say now. If you haven't already, do it now. And you definitely want to do it before you start looking to hire your GM. Because there's a limited set of qualified GMs out in the world. And so as much as you are interviewing GMs, GMs are interviewing you. And good GMs will have their pick. And if you aren't doing policy governance, what is your governance model? Do you have a model? Do you have a system? Or is it more ad hoc? Why would a GM want a boss who's not using a best practice tool? So again, it's not the only way to do it, but I haven't found one that's better. And if almost all the food co-ops are doing it, so how to implement it? Learn about policy governance. Today's a good start. Hopefully you're learning a little bit. There's more to learn beyond this almost hour. Start simple. Don't try to eat the elephant in one bite. Start simple. Maybe you start with, all you startups are talking about your impact, talking about why, talking about your ends. Mission is very close in that same world. You're talking about this stuff all the time. Every time you're recruiting members, every time you're going out in the community, you're talking about this. So maybe you just write this down into a sentence or two. You just agree on that. And you can start simply with that. Committee charters. That's another way to start really digging into delegation, digging into authority, accountability, monitoring. You can start play with some of these things. It's like, okay, we've got a committee. What are they assigned to do? When do they report back? Have clear committee charters that delineate and say all this stuff that you needed to say so you can have good accountability. And to be sure that all of this is written down like a policy. You can start with board policies. The first policy that any board needs to come up with is, how are we making decisions? Are we doing consensus? Are we doing majority vote? All those sorts of things. So you can start with some very simple ground rules for how the board is going to operate. And then practice these. And then at some point, what you want is you really want a full set of policies. And the best way to do that, and this is definitely a self-promotion plug here, but the best way that I've found is to hire an outside facilitator to come in and do what's known as a policy blitz. I've done a couple dozen of them, and you come in and you can knock out all your policies in a day. You can really work through them in an in-depth way and get them all crafted in one day. So it's not this project that I have seen boards that have tried to do it. Like every meeting, we're going to tackle a little bit at our board meeting. And over a year later, they're still working and they still don't have a full set. This is one where it's best to take the dive and try to tackle it all at once. Okay. Quickly. We've talked about a lot of this already. Why policy governance, best practice, at least in the food co-op world. What's better? And why spend time creating your own system? It'll help you be proactive. It'll help you be efficient. It'll help you achieve all those things we've been talking about in terms of accountability, delegation, clarity of roles, all that sort of stuff. Why not? Ooh, dun dun. These are things that I've heard. It's got that the limitations are in that weird negative language. So yeah, and we talked about that. We talked about why that weird negative language is actually more empowering. People say, oh, well, in policy governance, we're not allowed to talk about, and that's not true. What policy governance does is policy governance is really good at saying, look, when you delegate doesn't just mean you're going to do this. It means you're going to do this and I'm not. So that point of delegation requires a handoff. So we don't want the board delegating something and then also having their hands in on that. So we talk about hands out, eyes in. And the board and the GM can talk about anything. And what makes those conversations able to happen is, first of all, they should be strategic conversations. I'm not sure talking about the price of beans is something you could do. I'm not sure that's a strategic conversation. And the board wants to be careful about how it spends its time. But the board can absolutely say, hey, we want to talk about this. And the best way to make that happen is to clarify before the conversation starts and during, we are not changing our direction on this. We want to learn more. We want to have a conversation about this. If we decide to change authority and delegation, we will do that. But we're allowed to have these conversations. We're allowed to have this communication. They say policy governance, boards become rubber stamp, boards' hands are tied. The GM has too much authority. Well, the GM has a ton of authority. That is true. I'm not sure how you can adequately run a co-op without that. Boards, again, only have authority as a decision-making body if they meet for 2 hours. They meet for 3 hours once a month. That's less than 40 hours a year. You need to be agile. So you don't want boards involved in decision-making at the operational level, because the operation needs to be agile. And again, the board can choose to not delegate things. The problem comes is that it's easiest to delegate all of it and hold the GM accountable for all of the performance than to pick and choose. Because once you start picking and choosing, then you have to sort out which elements affected performance that were ours and which were the GM's. Policy governance can be hard to learn. That's true. That's true. It can be a little hard to really get a feel for it, get to work it well. I'm not sure that that's any different than governance in any way. Governance can be hard to learn. It can take a while to learn how to do it well. It's not necessarily intuitive. And, flying a plane isn't intuitive, and it's hard to learn. But that doesn't mean it's not worth taking the time to invest to do that, so we can do great things. The challenge of policy governance can breed board apathy. That can be a tough one. So it's helpful to find ways to make policy governance fun, engaging, to make it relevant. How to make it not awful and maybe even fun. Well, for me, bringing efficiency and clarity to board work and clear accountability and knowing you're making an impact, to me, that makes it fun. And then because we're doing these things in this way, you can have phenomenal monitoring in a short amount of time with policy governance. And so you can have a tremendous amount of oversight, which makes more room for those strategic conversations we want to have. And that's where the fun stuff is for me, playing in that sandbox. All right. How about some questions?
We've got a couple really good ones that I promised I would circle back to. So if you don't mind, I'm going to be select a few out here.
Yep, please do.
We've got a really good one from Barbara that I want to go back to, and I'm trying to find it again. Unless Barbara has off the top of her head and wants to unmute.
Do every ends have related means and limitations?
That's the one.
Do means and limitations ever exist without being related to an end? I would say in the broadest sense, yes, they're tied together. In a detailed sense, they're not tied together at all. So in the broadest sense, yes, the organization exists to achieve these ends. And the means are not necessarily, the policies aren't written as this is how we're going to achieve those ends. The policies are written for, the means are how the board is going to operate and the limitations in which the GM is going to operate under while we go to achieve those ends. So they're related in a broad sense, but not at a detail level.
It's a common question we see come up with startups, which is wanting to dictate the means that the ends are met through. And I think it could be a whole session unto itself. And there are some co-op industries outside of food co-ops that do have the board and the GM work together to define the means for the ends. So it's not off the table and it's a bigger conversation, but usually there are no means definitions handed to the GM, they provide them. Is that correct, Joel?
Yep.
Okay. Leah said, are some board policies part of the co-op's bylaws or are they always separate? I thought that was
that is a great question.
Yeah.
So this is Joel's take on it. Bylaws are typically not part of your policy. Bylaws supersede your policy. So bylaws are the agreement between your organization and the state in which you are incorporated. So you are obligated to do everything that's in your bylaws or not do the things that your bylaws say you're not supposed to do. So all of your policies should be in alignment with your bylaws. Personally, I like to add relevant bylaws into my policies as reference. So when we are monitoring those aspects of our work and our expectations, we're sure that we're not forgetting about the stuff that's in our bylaws. So when I work with boards, we put that bylaw stuff in there so that they're in our policies, but it's just a direct copy, and it's just there to be sure that we don't drop the ball on that. Because while we're monitoring our policies, we also want to monitor all of our obligations and expectations that are set in the bylaws.
I loved that question.
Yeah, so great.
I think a lot of us would have loved to have known that more clearly before we got involved with co-op boards. What do all these pieces do? Where does the bylaws land? I love how you defined it. That's your legal agreement between you and the state, and your policies are under those. Love that. Were there other questions specific to, there was a question about, so where does the project manager come into all of this? And I was like, I touched on it, but I thought I'd throw that back to you.
Yeah, so typically the project manager is there before the GM. And so you would just swap in project manager for the general manager in those situations. And maybe at the early stage, maybe the board has 2 employees. So the delegation tree might be a little bit more complicated, because the board is going to be delegating to committees, might be delegating some things to individuals. Some of those individuals might be board members, they might be staff. All of that delegation should be written down clearly, either in policy form, committee charter, some other form, and then monitored regularly.
Great. Other questions folks want to throw? Did I miss anything in the chat you guys want to bring back to our attention? What is a committee charter?
I have examples. I have a sample template that I can share, but essentially what the committee charter is it clearly lays out what that committee, why that committee exists, what its outcomes are to be. So not just that it's created around a concept, but that it is actual things it's there to produce. So we don't just get together and talk about community engagement, talk about member engagement. It's actually there to produce things. And maybe it's just there to produce a plan, but it's still there. It's still there to produce something. And then it should also have the structure of the committee, any budget that the committee has. What does reporting back look like? Oh, a written report every month sent to the secretary 5 months or 5 days before the packet goes out. Great. What authority does the committee have? What's the committee's calendar? All of these things, if they're laid out in a committee charter, just makes it clear for everybody. And again, we can have that accountability. We can have that delegation, clean delegation, clarity of roles and responsibilities, and accountability.
So the committee charter is like you said, like the bylaws of the agreement between the state and the co-op. The committee charter is the agreement between the board and the committee who's been handed authority.
Yes.
I love that. Okay, this is also an opportunity, so I'm going to say it, which is if any of you want to receive that committee charter example and or slides from this session from Joel, please put your email in the chat. FCI does not hand out your personal information to anyone, even when you register for an event. So you have to, so if you want to get stuff from them, you want to be on their email list, you want to get those follow-ups, please put it all in the chat and I will share that with them and then they can get you information.
We did have one other question in the chat. So there was a question on the chart. I forget which one was it, Joel, but what's the meaning of the dashed line for delegation, or is there meaning?
It's just to show that handoff point, that the board has authority, and now we're going to hand off part of that authority to some other entity. So, and that's what the point of delegation refers to there. And we just use the dash line so it looked different than all the other solid lines.
Sweet, thanks. And then we got another one here. Are there some ends topics that are typical for grocery topics or grocery co-ops? Sorry.
Are there some topics that you'll find in ends?
Sounds like it. Yeah. Like standard, often you see them kind of thing.
worded, I have a bunch of different samples, but typically what we see in ends is the community is healthier, the community has access to healthy food, the community is more educated around healthy food. We have impacts around jobs that pay well. Sometimes that's part of the end, sometimes that's more of a means to be sure that employees, that there's jobs in our community. So those are the ones that are more common. Sometimes we're supporting food systems, sometimes we're supporting local producers, farmers, growers. Sometimes that's part of our ends. Sometimes we're about building community, that there's a gathering place, or that there's community gathering together. So I can send samples for that.
We definitely had requests for that. And just for fun, I'm going to throw you some example ends from my home co-op there, because I happen to like ours. All right. Any other last questions? We need to wrap up in just 1 minute. Okay. All right then. Well then, we're going to take this moment to say a huge thank you to Joel for being here to share with us once again about governance, its importance, and actually making it fun and digestible, which it isn't always. So thank you so much to Joel from 7 Roots. And again, if you want to get materials from Joel, some of those examples he mentioned and so forth, please put your email in the chat. Coming up later today, you guys wanted lots of governance topics. So we have systems and document repositories. Grant Kessler and Matthew Ruffey, a past board chair and current board chair of Chicago Market, will be here talking about how they have successfully set up systems for tracking all of those documents that boards have to be on top of, all those pieces of information, and making it work. This becomes a much bigger issue when you get into stage 2, late stage 2. There's just so much to keep track of. They're going to show you what's worked for them and talk about that. So you guys requested the topic. I think it's going to be great. Then we're taking a little break until next week. We got a lot going on next week. I'll be doing a quick one on using visual timelines. We have a new tool that we are putting out that is a sample visual timeline that you can just put your co-op's information into, showing the stages of what has to happen to develop your co-op and where you're at currently to educate your community and your owners. So we'll be going over that Monday, as well as I'm really excited about this one. We're going to have a peer presentation, a case study from West Georgia Farmers Cooperative. This is an existing farmers co-op, Black-led, Black-owned farmers cooperative that's been around since the 1960s in West Georgia, that is decided to further their mission by building a grocery store within their community where is deeply needed, that will carry their food as well as a full line of groceries. It's an approach no one's ever done before. I've never seen an established food co-op in a rural community do that, or establish a farmer co-op do this. So we're really excited to hear their story. We hope you'll come out and join us. Once again, just want to thank our sponsors for this summer 2023 FCI Live series. Would not be possible without them. Special shout out to National Cooperative Grocers, as well as all these other wonderful orgs down here who help make it possible. All right, and with that, thank you everyone for joining us. And if you have one more question and you want to stay,